Meyer Guggenheim broke 7 sticks in front of his sons, one at a time, dry pine, each one snapping clean. Then he bound 7 more together, handed the bundle to Daniel, the strongest, and told him to try. Daniel couldn't do it. Nobody could. "Together you are invincible," Meyer said. "Stay together, my sons, and the world will be yours." By 1912, the world very nearly was. 7 sons, each stationed like a general along a different front of a mining empire that stretched from the frozen Yukon to the Atacama Desert in Chile, from the copper veins of Montana to the diamond concessions of the Belgian Congo. They controlled the American Smelting and Refining Company, the largest processor of non-ferrous metals on Earth. They owned Chuquicamata, a copper deposit so vast it would still be producing ore a century later. They had smelters in Colorado, Mexico, New Jersey. The family's combined wealth, difficult to calculate even at the time, placed them alongside the Rockefellers and the Carnegies in any honest accounting of American fortunes. But the bundle was already losing sticks. Benjamin went down with the Titanic in April of that year. William had been quietly pushed to the margins, his interests in the firm reduced to a name on paper. Solomon's only son would die without children of his own. Simon's boys were already gone, dead young, their absence so total it would eventually produce not an heir but a memorial foundation. And in 1923, without fanfare, without a press conference, without a single rival having broken through the gates, Isaac Guggenheim, the last of the 7 still active in the partnership, simply retired. Guggenheim Brothers didn't collapse. It didn't lose a war. It went quiet because there was no one left who needed it to be loud. That silence is the story. Not a crash, not a scandal that brought regulators to the door, not a palace coup by some hungry outsider. The largest mining empire ever assembled by a single family dissolved the way a body does when the organs fail one by one and no transplant arrives. The fortune didn't vanish. It became buildings, became the museum on Fifth Avenue, the foundation in Bilbao, the fellowship grants that still bear the name. But the empire, the operational thing that Meyer Guggenheim spent 40 years constructing, ended because the men it was built for either died or drifted or never produced sons of their own to inherit the hunger. What Meyer understood as a discovery, something he'd clawed toward through decades of necessity, his sons inherited as a settled fact. The bundle holds. Of course the bundle holds. They'd never seen it tested otherwise. And a truth you've never had to prove for yourself is the first truth you'll let go of when the grip gets inconvenient. So the question isn't how the Guggenheim empire fell, it's why it couldn't reproduce the single quality that built it. And to answer that, you have to go back to a 19-year-old boy stepping off a ship in Philadelphia in 1847 with nothing that would have predicted what came next. Meyer Guggenheim arrived in the United States from Lengnau, Switzerland, a village in the canton of Aargau where Jewish families had been confined for generations. The restrictions were specific and grinding. Jews in Lengnau couldn't own land, couldn't enter most trades, couldn't live outside designated streets. Meyer's father, Simon, made a living as a tailor and sometime peddler, and the family understood from birth that survival meant finding the margin in someone else's economy and working it harder than anyone thought worthwhile. Philadelphia in 1847 was a city of nearly 500,000, industrializing fast, full of German and Swiss immigrants who carried with them a network of kinship and credit that didn't require English to function. Meyer started where his father had, peddling, carrying household goods door to door in the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania. The work was physical, repetitive, and offered one advantage to a man paying attention. You learned what people bought. You learned what moved and what sat. You learned the difference between selling a product and selling someone else's product at a sliver of markup. Within a few years, Meyer had shifted from peddling to manufacturing, specifically stove polish, a commodity in coal-heated homes. Then he moved into lace and embroidery, importing Swiss-made goods through contacts he still maintained in Aargau. The lace business grew steadily, and by the 1870s Monsieur Guggenheim and Sons was a respectable Philadelphia importing firm, prosperous enough that Meyer could have stopped, could have settled into the comfortable mercantile life that thousands of other immigrant families occupied without complaint. He didn't stop. And the reason he didn't stop is the reason the empire existed at all. In 1881, Meyer accepted a 1/2 interest in 2 silver mines in Leadville, Colorado, the A and the Minnie. reportedly as settlement for a debt. Leadville was then one of the most frenzied mining towns in the American West, a place at 10,000 feet where fortunes materialized and evaporated within single seasons. The mines Meyer now partly owned were flooded, unworkable in their current state. A cautious man would have written off the investment. Meyer put roughly $20,000 into draining them. What came out once the water was gone was a silver-lead deposit of extraordinary richness. This is where the story splits from 100 other immigrant success tales, because Meyer did something with that windfall that most mine owners in Leadville never considered. He looked at who was actually getting rich, and it wasn't the men pulling ore out of the ground. It was the men who processed it, the smelters and refiners who stood between the raw earth and the finished metal and took their percentage from every ton that passed through. Meyer later put it plainly. He was on the wrong side of the mining business. The mine owner assumed the risk, the geological uncertainty, the flooding, the cave-ins, the played-out veins. The smelter took delivery of whatever came up and charged a fee regardless. It was, in its way, the same lesson he'd learned peddling stove polish in Pennsylvania coal towns. Don't carry someone else's goods on your back for their margin. Own the step where the margin lives. In 1888, he founded the Philadelphia Smelting and Refining Company, building a smelter in Pueblo, Colorado, that processed ore not just from his own mines, but from dozens of independents who had no choice but to come to him or his competitors. And his competitors were the established Smelting Trust, a cartel that had controlled refining prices for years and did not welcome a Philadelphia lace importer into their business. Meyer fought them. He undercut their prices, absorbed short-term losses, and kept his smelter running when the trust expected him to fold. He won because he could afford patience. The lace business was still generating income. He wasn't leveraged the way a pure mining speculator would have been. He had a flaw beneath him, and the trust didn't know how to break a man who had one. By the early 1890s, the Guggenheim smelters were processing enough ore to force the trust into negotiation rather than war. Meyer had 7 sons, and he stationed them throughout the operation like officers in a campaign. Isaac handled finance. Daniel, the most operationally gifted, oversaw expansion. Murray, Solomon, Benjamin, Simon, William, each assigned a role, each kept out of college because Meyer believed the business itself was the education that mattered. This wasn't sentiment, it was structure. He needed bodies he could trust absolutely, and the only bodies that met that standard shared his blood. The model worked because it had to. Meyer couldn't hire professional managers and trust them with the full picture the way a Rockefeller or a Carnegie could, because Meyer's competitive advantage wasn't capital or technology. It was speed of decision-making across a family network where loyalty was inherited and betrayal was unthinkable. 7 sons, stationed from New York to Mexico to Colorado, could move faster than a board of directors. They didn't need to deliberate. They simply executed. Daniel took this logic and scaled it to the size of continents. Under his direction, the family acquired interest in Alaskan gold during the Yukon Rush. They moved into copper in Utah and Montana. They took a controlling stake in the American Smelting and Refining Company itself, the very trust Meyer had once fought, absorbing their former enemy into the family structure. And then, in 1913, they acquired Chuquicamata. Chuquicamata was a copper deposit in Chile's Atacama Desert so large that its open pit would eventually become visible from space. The Guggenheims didn't discover it. Copper had been mined there for centuries, but they recognized its scale before anyone else committed the capital to exploit it at industrial volume, and they moved before the competition organized. This was Daniel's gift, the ability to see a resource not as it was currently being used, but as it could be used if you controlled every step from extraction to sale. By 1915, the family's reach was almost incomprehensible in its breadth. Copper in Chile, gold in Alaska, tin in Bolivia, diamonds and rubber in the Belgian Congo, smelters across the American West and into Mexico, and control of Asarco, which itself processed ore from hundreds of independent mines. The Guggenheims weren't just miners, they were the infrastructure through which other people's mining became money, and every piece of it rested on Meyer's original insight. Don't dig for someone else's profit. Own the smelter. Own the step where raw material becomes refined commodity, because that step never goes away regardless of which individual mine runs dry. It was a beautiful structure, self-reinforcing, nearly monopolistic in certain metals, governed by men who had grown up inside it and knew no other world. But Meyer had also, without intending to, guaranteed something else. His sons had never needed to discover the insight for themselves. They'd never peddled stove polish. They'd never stood in a flooded mine shaft in Leadville and calculated whether $20,000 was worth the gamble. They'd never been on the wrong side of the mining business because they'd been born on the right side of it. The bundle held in their hands because Meyer had bound it before they were old enough to understand what a single stick felt like snapping. Daniel, to his credit, understood this at some level. He drove the expansion with an urgency that suggested he knew the window wouldn't stay open forever. But Daniel was one man, the eldest, the one Meyer had trusted most deeply with operational command. The others occupied their positions and drew their shares and lived lives that grew progressively more distant from the smelter floor in Pueblo, where the family's real education had taken place. The empire Meyer built was an organism perfectly adapted to one man's hunger, then staffed by 7 men who'd inherited the structure, but not the condition that made it necessary. Every advantage Meyer gave his sons, the unified command, the vertical integration, the refusal to let them disperse into professions or marriages that might dilute their focus, also insulated them from the specific pressure that had made Meyer capable of building it in the first place. You can see the paradox forming if you know where to look, and it starts to become visible not in the boardroom, not in the ledgers, but in the private lives of the sons themselves, where the male line began to thin before anyone noticed it was happening. Robert Guggenheim died in 1875. He was 11 years old. The cause is lost to the record, one of those 19th century childhood deaths that family histories note in a single line and move past. Meyer had 7 sons who survived to adulthood, 7 sons who entered the business, 7 sons who formed the bundle, but he'd had 8. Robert was the stick that snapped before it was ever bound with the others, and his death carries no commercial significance whatsoever. No partnership was restructured, no share was redistributed. Meyer buried a child in Philadelphia and continued building his empire because that is what men of his generation did with grief. They worked through it. But Robert's death matters here because it establishes something about the Guggenheim line that the family's later wealth would obscure. Sons died. They died young, they died without heirs, they died in ways that could not be predicted or prevented by any amount of capital. Meyer's empire was designed to be hereditary, to pass through male bodies from generation to generation, each son holding his stick in the bundle and passing it to his own son in turn. The design assumed those bodies would be there. It assumed continuity, and from the very beginning, from before the first smelter was built in Pueblo, the assumption was already wrong. 27 years after Robert, the assumption broke again. Benjamin Guggenheim was the 5th son. He was charming, sociable, comfortable in a way his older brothers were not. Daniel worked, Isaac calculated. Solomon invested with careful deliberation. Benjamin spent. He moved through European capitals with an ease that suggested a man who had never worried about where the next dollar would come from, because of course he hadn't. His involvement in the family business was peripheral at best. He held his share, attended what was required of him, and lived a life that was largely ornamental to the enterprise. Among Meyer's sons, he was the one who most fully inhabited the paradox of inherited wealth without inherited necessity. He didn't need the smelter, he didn't need copper, he needed only to remain a Guggenheim, and the income followed. In April 1912, Benjamin booked a first-class passage on the RMS Titanic. He was 46 years old. He was travelling with his valet, Victor Gilio, and whatever business or pleasure had drawn him to Europe was finished. He was going home. When the ship struck the iceberg just before midnight on April 14th, Benjamin initially appeared in a life jacket with the other passengers. But at some point in the confusion, he made a decision. He went back to his stateroom. He changed into evening clothes. He and Giglio both dressed deliberately, formally, as if preparing for dinner rather than death. A steward later reported that Benjamin told him they had dressed in their best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen. He was last seen in the first-class smoking lounge. Accounts suggest brandy. His body was never recovered. It's a remarkable death, and it has been romanticised endlessly since 1912. The gentleman who chose to die well, the man who wouldn't take a seat from a woman or child, and perhaps that's all it was, a final act of decency from a man who had the luxury of performing decency because he'd never had to fight for survival. But consider the position Benjamin occupied in Meyer's structure. He was a son without operational purpose. He held a share but carried no weight. His brothers ran the mines, ran the smelters, ran Asarco. Benjamin ran nothing. He dressed beautifully. He travelled well. and when the moment came where survival required something ungraceful, something desperate, something beneath the dignity of a Guggenheim of his particular temperament, he chose the lounge instead. He left behind an estate far smaller than his brother's holdings. He left behind a daughter named Peggy, who was 13 years old. The Titanic sank the same year Maya died, the patriarch and the fifth son gone within months of each other, and neither departure caused the empire to falter, because Daniel still held the operational reins, and the structure still functioned as designed. But the bundle was now 5 sticks instead of 7, and one of those 5 was about to be cast out entirely. William Guggenheim was the youngest. In 1900, he married Grace Brown Herbert, a woman who was not only a Gentile but a divorcee. The marriage produced a family crisis that went beyond mere disapproval. In the world the Guggenheims inhabited, a world of Jewish industrialist families where alliances were made carefully and reputation was guarded as fiercely as capital, William's choice represented something close to betrayal. The details of the estrangement are murky in the public record, but the outcome is clear. William was pushed out, not violently, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of men who controlled the partnership documents. He lived until 1941. He lived rich by any ordinary standard, but he lived outside the bundle, and the bundle carried on without him, as though he had never been part of it at all. So now, count the sticks. Maya's 8 sons had become 7. 7 became 5 after the Titanic and the estrangement, and of those 5, the question of the next generation was already answering itself in silence. Solomon had one son, Erwin Guggenheim, Solomon's heir, the man who should have carried the family's industrial legacy into the middle of the 20th century, died without children. The details of his life are sparse in the public record, because there is no empire for the record to attach them to. He held no command and left no successor. His branch of the line simply ended. Simon's sons died young, and Isaac retired. Daniel drove the expansion alone through the 1910s with a ferocity that looks, in retrospect, like a man racing against a demographic fact he could see but not prevent. And then came the smelting war, and the war's aftermath, and the slow settling of an empire that had no one left to inherit it. The smelting war of 1900 to 1901 is the event that should mark the Guggenheim peak, the moment the family forced its terms on the House of Morgan and absorbed Asarco rather than being absorbed by it. On paper, it was a total victory. The Guggenheims entered the war as outsiders challenging the established trust. They emerged as the controlling interest inside that trust. Daniel negotiated from a position of proven operational superiority. The family's smelters consistently undercut the competition on cost, and Morgan's people eventually accepted that it was cheaper to merge with the Guggenheims than to compete against them. The 7 sons had taken the bundle Maya gave them and used it to break the largest industrial combination in American metals. But the victory contained its own dissolution. Once you control the trust, you are the trust. And a trust requires administrators, not founders. The specific Guggenheim advantage, family unity operating faster and more ruthlessly than a corporate board, becomes less necessary when you already own the board. The hunger that built the empire had no function inside the empire's final form. Daniel kept driving because he was Daniel, but around him, the reason to drive was evaporating. Then the First World War ended, and the metal prices that had surged during wartime collapsed. Copper dropped and lead dropped with it. The smelters still ran, but the margins that had made the Guggenheims phenomenally wealthy contracted sharply. In the post-war market, the empire required precisely the kind of patient, decade-long reinvestment that Maya had practiced in Leadville. It required men willing to sit with diminished returns and wait for the cycle to turn. It required, in other words, men who still needed the business, men for whom the alternative was poverty. There were no such men left. By 1923, Isaac Guggenheim, the last brother actively engaged in the family's industrial operations, stepped away. He was in his 70s. His brothers were dead, estranged, or occupied with other pursuits entirely. There was no son, no nephew, no grandson positioned to take his place. The family's controlling interests in Asarco, in Chuquicamata, in the vast network of smelters and mines and shipping routes that Maya had spent 40 years assembling, were sold, dispersed, converted to financial instruments managed by bankers who had no particular reason to keep the bundle bound. The sticks separated quietly, without crisis, without a rival's cunning or a market crash or a government seizure. The Guggenheim empire ended because the men it required simply were not there anymore. In 1919, Peggy Guggenheim turned 21. She received a trust valued at approximately $450,000. Her male cousins received millions. The disparity was not accidental or secretive. It was simply how the family operated. Benjamin had been the least consequential brother in business terms. His estate was the smallest. And Peggy was a woman in a family that had been structured from Meyer's first partnership agreement around the presumption that sons carried the work forward. She was told, in effect, to find her own way. She found it. Solomon Guggenheim, in the years after the empire's dissolution, turned to art. Guided by an artist and advisor named Hilary Bay, he began collecting non-objective paintings, abstractions that had no representational anchor in the material world. In 1939, he founded the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in New York. He commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to design a permanent home for the collection, a building that would itself be a work of art. Wright designed the spiral, and construction took years. Solomon died in 1949. Wright died in April 1959. The building opened on Fifth Avenue in October of that year, 6 months after its architect's death, and a decade after its patron's. Neither man saw it finished. Daniel took a different path. He established the Daniel Guggenheim Fund for the promotion of aeronautics in 1926, pouring money into research and education, at a moment when powered flight was still an uncertain proposition for most investors. The fund helped underwrite the infrastructure that made Charles Lindbergh's 1927 transatlantic crossing possible. Daniel saw the sky the way Meyer had seen the smelter, not the glamorous end product, but the system underneath it. And Peggy, with her smaller inheritance, her exclusion from every partnership, her father's absence and her family's indifference, went to Europe. She opened a gallery in London. She opened Art of this Century in New York in 1942. She collected Picasso, Pollock, Ernst, Brancusi, artists her uncle Solomon would not have recognized as non-objective enough for his Temple of Spirit. She moved to Venice in 1948. She installed her collection in the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni on the Grand Canal, and she lived among it until she died. The most famous Guggenheim of the 20th century was the one the family gave the lease to, the daughter of the man who dressed for dinner and drowned. The name is on a spiral on Fifth Avenue now. It's on a palazzo in Venice. It's on a titanium curve in Bilbao that draws more tourists than most European capitals' oldest museums. Each building stands alone. Each is permanent in the way that copper mines and smelters are not. Each carries a name that millions of people recognize without knowing it was paid for by copper mined in Chile's Atacama Desert, by diamonds pulled from the Congo, by 7 brothers who were never permitted to go to college because their father needed them in the same room. The bundle of sticks is gone. What remains are individual sticks, standing in separate cities, in separate countries, unbreakable because they carry no operational weight. They don't need to function together. A museum doesn't require 7 brothers holding it as one. A museum requires only that someone once spent the money. And then the building stands whether the family continues or not. People walk through Wright's spiral every day, ascending the ramp past Kandinsky's and Klee's, and they look up at the oculus and feel something close to awe. They don't think about Leadville. They don't think about Pueblo. They don't think about a man in evening clothes in a flooding ship, or an 11-year-old boy buried in Philadelphia before any of it began. The name is on the building. The men are not in it. And the fortune survived, finally, because it was spent on something that did not require another generation of sons willing to stand in the same room and hold.